All right, so we've got our database set up. We've set up or installed the entity framework into our project. So now how do we hook these two puppies together? So to start off, what we'll need to do is we need to create what's called a DB context. And the DB context really is nothing more than a class that we create that inherits the DB context base class. And the reason why we create it is because this class is the connector that the entity framework uses to connect our code to our database. So to do this, I like to go under models and I like to right click and say add, and I'm going to create a folder first, and I'm going to have this be data. And I'm going to put all of my data components, all of my data classes underneath this folder. So first thing I'm going to do is right click again on data and say add new class. And this will be my WSAD DB context. Now, again, this is a class just like any other, so the name is up to you, but I like to make them descriptive, at least so I know what they are. So this, for me, will be my WSAD DB context. I'll hit add. Now, I'll come up with a standard project, or I'm sorry. Now, I will come up with a standard class template. So the first thing I want to do is I want to inherit from the DB context base class. So I'm going to just put colon DB context. Now Visual Studio is going to come back and say, do you want to do WSAD DB context? And I'm going to go nope, and I'll hit escape. And then I'm going to click here, and then I'm going to get this little light bulb with quick actions. I'll click on that, and it'll pop up. It'll say, do you want to use the namespace of system.data.entity? And I will say yes. So I'll click on that, and it'll add my namespace, my using statement up above, and I'm now inheriting my WSAD DB project, or DB context is inheriting the DB context base class that comes out of system.data.entity. So I've got my context set up. So now what I need to do is I need to create what are called DB sets. And these DB sets are the way that I access my database tables from within the DB context. Now these are just properties. So I'm going to do prop, double tab, it gives me my property template, and then I'm going to type in DB set, and these are generic types, so I'm going to do a less than sign, and then I need to put in the name of the class that represents my users table, which I haven't created yet, but I'm going to go ahead and just call it user. I'm going to close that, and then I'm going to hit tab again, which will bring me over to the property name, and I'm going to make this property called users. So that will be my DB set property that allow me to access my TBL users table. So now we have to create a users or a user class. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to right click on data again, choose add, and choose class. And I'm going to create a class called user. Hit enter. So now a few things have happened real fast. First of all, I have a new user class. Second thing is I now have a complete DB set under my DB context. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save for now. I'm feeling good about this. So let's flip back to user. Now the user class should mimic the columns or fields that exist within our database table. So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to open my Server Explorer. I'm going to mount it by clicking the little thumbtack button. I'm going to, I don't have my connections there, so I'm going to open up app data again, and I'm going to double click on my MDF file, and this will remount it under Server Explorer. So now I'm going to twirl open tables, twirl open TBL user, and now I can see all of the fields or columns that exist inside that table. So I'm going to jump back into my user class, and my goal here is I need to create a property for each one of those fields in my table. So I'm going to use that prop snippet, double tab, and I'll start with an int, and that will be my ID field. So I'll do prop string first name, prop string last name, prop string email address, prop string username, prop string, you get the idea, password, prop, and then this is where we go bool is active, prop And I'm doing double tab bool, double tab is admin, prop double tab date time, double tab date created, prop double tab date time, double tab date modified. So now we have properties in our user class that match or mimic the fields in our TBL user. Now that we have all of that set up, we're ready to kind of take the next step forward. The first thing that we need to do is to make sure that the entity framework knows that this class called user matches TBL user. Now, the entity framework is actually a very intelligent system. It would be able to deduce most things because if our class names directly matched our table names, it would infer that those two things are connected. So if we had a user table in our database and we had a user class in our DB context, then it would say, oh, these two are the same thing. Because they're not, we have to help it. So what we need to do here is we need to go tab, and we're going to add an attribute to this user class. And we're going to do table. Now table does not exist yet within the using statements we have. So we'll have to drop down here, and we want to add the system.componentModel.dataAnnotations.schema namespace to our using statements. And then once that comes up, then we can do parentheses, and then what we want to pass in is the name of the table as a string, which will be TBL user. So that tells the entity framework that this is our user table. Now, the second thing we need to do is we need to identify this as a key field. Now, not a foreign key, but a key. So again, we have to drop down on our quick actions, and we want to also include the namespace of system.componentModel.dataAnnotations. So we'll add that using statement, and what this tells the entity framework is that this ID field is our primary key. So it now knows that ID is our primary key and that our user class maps to a table called TBL user. So we've now set up our DbContext, WSAD, DbContext. We've added a DbSet property for our user class, and that will map to our TBL user table. So this user's property will then represent in our code the TBL user table. We've also created a user class, and this class is actually there to act as the go-between or the programming implementation of our table. So we have all of our fields. We have properties created for each one of those fields, and we have them set up as our primary key, and we have our table mapping. The final thing that we'll need to do is that we will also need to set up our DbContext connection string. To do that, the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we have the exact name of our context, and in my case it's WSAD, DbContext with a capital D and a capital C. To make sure I do this right, I'm just going to copy that name, and then I'm going to open up my web config. And inside my web config, I'm going to have a series of different options, different elements, I should say. And what I like to do is I like to tuck this right in between app settings and system.web. So I'm going to do a new line here. I'm going to do a less than symbol, and I'm going to type in connection strings. And then I'll close that. It'll create the close tag. And I'm going to open up a new tag, and I'm going to do an add. And I'm going to set the name of this add equal to the name of my DbContext. So WSAD DbContext. The next thing is I'm going to put in here as my connection string value the connection string that connects to my database. Now, I've done this enough so I actually know what to type in, but it took me a long time to remember it. And even sometimes I'm not always certain. So what I like to do is I like to go out to the internet to a website called ConnectionStrings.com. People laugh when I tell them that, but it's real. So ConnectionStrings.com. And this site carries an entire archive of all the possible different connection strings that you would need to connect to different databases, different data sources. It's just a good reference to have in your back pocket. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to find SQL Server. And there it is. Click. And then we want to use the .NET Framework data providers for SQL Server. So I'm going to click on that. And even though I clicked on that, I'm still going to get a whole bunch of options. So the way that I like to do this is I like to do a Control F, and I like to search for local DB. So I'm going to be connecting to a local DB instance with a specific file name. So what I do is I copy this sample connection string. I'm going to do a Control C here, jump back into Visual Studio, and then I'm going to Control V or paste that connection string into that section of my connection string settings. I'm going to close these panels, and let's go ahead and I'm going to just bring this all up on one line. So what this does for me is it provides me with kind of a blueprint of how to set up this connection string. So my server will be a local DB server running on version 11 because I'm running SQL Server 2012 on my machine. Integrated security is true, and then the attached DB file name, this points to the MDF file under app data. Now, if you're thinking far enough ahead, you may go, well, how do I know where that lives? I know where it lives maybe on my machine, but how do I know where it lives on someone else's machine? How do I know where it lives when I get it to a server? Well, that's a good question. And the nice thing is that because we are running within the ASP.NET framework, we actually get some additional helpers and tokens that we can use. So instead of giving the absolute path, we can always point to the relative path by doing a pipe, which on my keyboard is located above the enter or return key. And I'm going to put data directory, close pipe, slash, and then the name of my MDF file. And I'm going to do an F2, or if you're on a Mac, it's function F2. I'm going to do a Control A and then Control C to copy the name of my MDF, jump back into my web config, and then paste that MDF name. So what this will do is it'll say data directory, which simply points to the app_data folder, and then it looks inside of there for WSAD-final project-db.mdf. So that now becomes my connection string for my DB context. I'll save that. And because my connection string name is the same name as my DB context, the entity framework will pick up that as my connection string for the context automatically. No need for me to do anything fancy or special to make those two pieces work together. The entity framework knows to look for this connection string here inside the web config. So we've got our context in place. We've created our first data model. These are called data models, or sometimes I'll refer to them as DTOs for data transfer objects. And with our DTOs in place and our context and our connection string, we are ready to start programming against our database. So this is actually a cut-in from the lecture to make a note about using Visual Studio 2015 and utilizing local DB. After doing some additional checks and testing, I've recognized that if you are using Visual Studio 2015 or a newer version of Microsoft SQL Server, such as Microsoft SQL Server 2014, the local DB connection string has actually changed. In the previous video, I referenced a connection string from ConnectionStrings.com, which utilized a connection string of server equals local DB slash, and then what was here was v11.0. And that is actually for SQL Server 2012. So starting with SQL Server 2014 or utilizing Visual Studio 2015, you will need to now use local DB in parentheses slash MSSQL local DB. That will be your server. So again, your server and your connection string should be server equals open parenthesis local DB close parenthesis slash MSSQL local DB. You can also find this connection string on my GitHub for this project. So if you have any questions, make sure you look there.